Hi, and welcome to ThreatTraq Essentials. We're going to take a look at some everyday cybersecurity lessons that we can learn from this week's stories on ThreatTraq. I'm here with John Hogeboom, who is a guest on the show this week. John, let's talk about first the story you brought to us, which was about a vulnerability in a very popular network-attached storage system. What is a network-attached storage?
So network-attached storage is basically a file server that is directly connected to the internet. Or to your network, I should say. So in old days, we would have maybe like an actual Windows server, and you would have disks attached to that, and your computer would connect to a Windows server that would have all your files and whatnot on it. They basically kind of bundled that all together in one standalone device called a network attached storage, and you plug it into the network with Ethernet, and you can just directly access it without having to set up
home, right?
Yeah, a lot of people use them for home, for backup storage, or just for sharing files, in their home network,
right.
For whatever purposes they might have.
So there's a vulnerability that's been found, and it's quite serious. What does it allow someone to do potentially?
So this vulnerability, if you either intentionally or accidentally expose that network attached storage for this specific type, this Lenovo model, to the internet, there's a vulnerability in it where somebody can access it without any authentication. They don't need to know a password or username or anything, and see the files that are on there. In fact, Google, the search engine, has already kind of unintentionally indexed a bunch of these devices just because their crawler process that goes and crawls the internet
it's easy
found
to do
them.
For a hacker.
Yeah, easy enough that the Google search engine that goes and crawls the internet found them and indexed a bunch of these devices.
So if you have
already.
this device, you should make the assumption that someone's able to get on it if it's attached to the internet, right?
Yes, I would make that assumption.
How do you protect yourself then?
So Lenovo has released patches for, I believe, many, if not all, of the models that are impacted by this vulnerability. Even though some of them are end of life, I believe they might have actually put out some critical patches for those particular end of life ones. So I would refer people to go look at the Lenovo website, see if their model's impacted, because there's a lot of different types of models out there. You might not be impacted. If you are, download the patch, install it, and that should mitigate this vulnerability.
Well, Manny brought us a story about a group of hackers that were getting onto people's computers claiming to do something good, right? They were putting in a cryptocurrency miner. What does that do, basically? I mean, it's a very complicated thing, but just briefly, a cryptocurrency miner does what?
So the way you can get cryptocurrency from a mining perspective is you actually have to kind of solve a problem. It's a cryptographical problem.
So there's actually work involved.
There's work involved,
right.
Yes.
But it's done by a computer.
Computational task that needs to be executed to solve and find the next coin available. So that's what there's software that does that.
So it would be advantageous if I wanted to earn as much cryptocurrency as possible if I could have a bunch of computers doing that computation, but if I don't, it would be great if I could get everybody else's computers to do it for me.
Right, because if you have one machine doing it, it's going to take a really long time. But they have things called pools where you can get a whole bunch of machines and pool them into a group, and then they can kind of work on the same problem together. And then you'll be able to do things a lot more efficiently than having one machine do it. You can split the work out to a whole maybe 1,000 machines that you have, and you'll have a better likelihood of solving or getting that next crypto coin.
Now, the people who did this also sent a message to the people who had this malware on their computer claiming, oh, it's not malware, we're trying to make the internet safer. Now, we should be skeptical of that.
Right.
But in general, is there a lesson we can learn even beyond cryptocurrency mining about allowing people to put things on your computer?
Right, well, I mean, breaching into somebody else's machine without permission is always illegal. So the fact that they did it but then left a message behind saying, oh no, but we didn't mean to do anything bad, does not absolve them from guilt of doing something wrong. It's not right to do that. It's not legal. But it's also a very common thing, especially in these spaces where you have servers. This particular group is targeting specific software packages where they know that there's very new vulnerabilities that have been discovered, and they've very quickly integrated that into their scanning kits to look for that out on the internet and recruit those devices into their botnet.
In general, it's a good idea never to allow a source that you don't know to place anything on your computer or let them use it external or remote.
Right, yeah. As best as possible, you should filter access to your device as best as possible. Sometimes that's not trivial to do, especially if it's a website and it's supposed to be visited by who knows. But if it isn't, try to reduce your attack surface by limiting it to only those people that need to absolutely reach it. And then make sure you have a good patching process. You should check pretty regularly if there's new patches for the software that you use on your system, especially the ones that have internet-facing touch points. So those ones would be more critical to make sure that they're patched on a more regular basis than the underlying Linux system, in my opinion. Not that you shouldn't do all of them, but the ones that have people can actually touch and interact with, or bad guys could, are the ones that you want to make sure you have a pretty good patching process around.
Lastly, Manish brought us a story about a backdoor in Linux desktop systems. Now, a lot of people out there may not be using Linux. What is a Linux desktop system? What does that do?
So Linux is really popular in the server space. In more recent years, within the past 10 years or so, there have been variations of Linux made as kind of a desktop version, very equivalent to what you would get with Windows or Mac, but it's running under Linux, which is generally free for the most part. Most versions are, unless you want special support.
You mentioned in the discussion that one of the things about something that changes your whole desktop really has a lot of access to your machine. Is there any advice you can give people who are using any operating system about doing those kinds of changes or downloading plugins that change their desktop or interface?
Right, so I'd be really careful about installing extensions from a third party that you don't really know, or who is this guy, who wrote this thing, but they make it easy nowadays. Even with our phones, we have apps that you can just install. You don't know who wrote that app necessarily, whether it's been vetted and whatnot. Same thing with plugins that you might have for your browser. So that's another thing very similar. You have a browser, you might have a nice extension that does something to maybe block ads or do some other functionality in your browser that you think is really great and useful, but there could be something it's doing in the back end that you don't know.
So you need to be careful.
You need to be careful.
You need to know where you're getting your software from,
right,
from a trusted source.
Right.
Well, that's great. Thanks, John. That's it for this week's ThreatTraq Essentials. As always, you can click on the playlist below to take a deeper dive into any of these stories. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.